Hello, how are you doing? I hope you had a good reading month in October and a good month in general. If you want to let me know about some of the best or the worst things that you read over October, I'd love to hear about them in the comments below. I personally had quite a good reading month. I read 10 books and all of them quite good. Some of them I would classify as just good, and there were some that were really excellent. And so I'm going to get into talking about all the different books that I'd read. I'd love to know if you've read any of these as well, and if you have any thoughts about them. It'd be great to have a discussion about them because I think there's a lot to say about all of them. So I'm going to start off talking about Lauren Groff's novel Matrix, which I just started reading and talking about at the end of my last month's reading wrap-up. And when I put another book down that I wasn't enjoying so much, and I picked this book up because I enjoyed it so much more. And yeah, this is the story of a woman that's sort of born into nobility, but illegitimately in the 12th century. And the queen at that time just sort of wants to get her out of the way, so sends her to live in a nunnery in Angleterre, as it's called at that time, later known as England, and lives in there in a nunnery, and which is a pretty dilapidated place, and a lot of the nuns there are actually starving, and so she sort of takes charge of things and turns the fortune of this nunnery around, makes it a real place in the local community, and it starts being a profitable venture, and so we follow her throughout the course of her life as she's doing this and developing a sisterhood with the women that live there. Many of them are sort of outcasts in society that don't have any other place, and so have found a home there. And yeah, it's really striking how she writes about the bonds of these women in this time period and finding this special place for themselves. But what I think is so extraordinary about this book is how she also interrogates that and interrogates the story of the protagonist. She doesn't it's not just a sort of harmonious story of sisterhood, but there's a lot of infighting between these different women, but there's also love affairs as well, and romantic entanglements, and so she gets into all the details about that, and then but also about how she is doing this for the good of the women and this collective group, but also it's partly about her own ego, and as the story goes on, it's about that as well, but also about the development of capitalism in our society, and how that comes to take such a central place in the world, and is sort of interrogating that as well, because it's sort of about power and money and about the corrupting influences of that. And so later on in the book it calls into question that, and I think it's so interesting how it does that. I mean, I did have some issues with the story in that it did take me a little while to get into it, because you are following the entire course of her life. So at one point, early on, she's a young woman, and then suddenly she's going through the menopause, and it makes that leap quite quickly, I think, and so I was sort of wait, hold on, there's a whole lot of things I'm sure that went along in the meantime. But then if you think about at the sort of time period, yeah, there were probably long stretches of time with not a lot happening in this rural area of what was to be England, and so yeah, it's probably right that she focuses on the dramatic events of both her life and the life of the people in this nunnery. And there are some very dramatic moments. There's a part where the local community is rising up against them and wants to, is staging almost this rebellion, and so the nuns are kind of fending them off. So there's a lot of fun elements to the story like that, as well as being quite a thoughtful book and reflection on the evolution of this woman's life and the meaning of our romantic entanglements as going through the course of her life. I mean, throughout her life, she holds this real passion and love and devotion for the Queen, but then it really like interrogates that relationship as well, because obviously that's not reciprocated by the Queen. And yeah, I found that really fascinating. So yeah, this is a great book. I also read Alison MacLeod's very long novel Tenderness, which just came out a month or so ago. And before reading this novel, I read Lady Chatterley's Lover by D.H. Lawrence, because this novel Tenderness is so much about this novel and about D.H. Lawrence's life and the trials around this novel to do with its obscenity, or what was labeled as its obscenity, since it was originally written and published in 1928. It was D.H. Lawrence's final novel, but it was the full, complete version of it wasn't allowed to be published until the early 1960s, when there were obscenity trials for it, both in the UK and in the US. And so she follows this story. It sort of mainly starts off with D.H. Lawrence's life and what was happening towards the end of his life, and his ill health, and his very difficult relationship with a woman that he was having, this like extraordinary woman, but who was quite difficult in a lot of ways. And so following that relationship and the creation of this novel, which D.H. Lawrence originally or was thinking of calling it Tenderness rather than Lady Chatterley's Lover, and following the development of that, but then also how the trial around that, how the FBI had a special interest in the obscenity trials around Lady Chatterley's Lover, and was following it and sort of getting involved in that in the pernicious way that the FBI got involved in a lot of things around the 60s and during the Cold War. And Alison MacLeod said that she was inspired to write this novel, initially inspired to write it because of seeing this detail about the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover's weird interest in this trial and this novel, which, I mean, you would think, looking back on it retrospectively, like, don't you have bigger things to be thinking about rather than whether this novel is going to be allowed to be published or not? But it goes into the whole issues around sort of morality at that time, and how certain institutions saw themselves as like the watchguard of what was going to be allowed in the reading public, and whether those books would be pushing a certain agenda. And they had obviously labeled D.H. Lawrence's work as something that was dangerous or might incite the public to live in a way which was different from the ideas of how they wanted society to be organized. And so yeah, it's really interesting how it gets into all of the details of that, and how a special agent was sent out to read this novel, but also monitor certain key figures' interest in it, including Jacqueline Kennedy. So I didn't realize this before going into reading the novel, but Jacqueline Kennedy plays a large part in the novel. And I mean, she was a critic and an editor before she went on to become First Lady, and that took up such a role in her life. And so she was interested in D.H. Lawrence, as well as the literary critic Lionel Trilling, and he plays a place in this novel as well, and he has conversations with Jacqueline Kennedy about the novel. And so it's sort of fascinating how there are sort of literary critiques of D.H. Lawrence and this novel, Lady Chatterley's Lover, within this novel, as well as it being a story about that as well. And so there's all these different layers to this novel, and I think it's so fascinating how it plays out, and there's so much to say about this book. And one of the interesting things that Alison MacLeod does is she incorporates into the text of this the D.H. Lawrence's own text. And so you can see there are some bits of the text which are in lighter colors, and I think that's D.H. Lawrence's text, which is taken out and integrated within the text of this story to show it sort of like builds upon the ideas of what was actually happening around the creation of the book and how those ideas filtered into D.H. Lawrence's art and how he, incorporated those ideas into what he was writing. And so there are multiple levels of reflection on the text of D.H. Lawrence's novel, as well as building a really compelling story in itself. I was really gripped by so many parts of this story and how the story builds and goes backwards and forwards in time and between different people's points of view, between the special agent and Jacqueline Kennedy and J. Edgar Hoover and a young female student who had a familial connection with D.H. Lawrence himself, and a story that D.H. Lawrence wrote about her family, which the family saw as like a big betrayal of them and was in a lot of way a betrayal of their confidence in their lives, but also was sort of commenting on things and is like a literary work in itself. And so it's so fascinating, how this novel builds upon all those layers. I'm still like pondering it and thinking about it. There's just so much of this book. I think it's a really impressive creation and work of art in itself, and I really enjoyed the experience of it. So a really great book that I hope more people will read, because I think I've not seen all that many people talk about it, because I think partly because it is such a long novel, so it's quite a commitment to read, but one that I think is really worthwhile. Then I also read Bernardine Evaristo's Manifesto, which was such a pleasure and a joy to read. It's fairly short. It's only a couple 100 pages long, but you get so many details of her life, and of course, because it's a memoir, there's lots of photos of the development of her life and her marriage, and then leading on to winning the Booker Prize, because she's an author that had published several novels before writing her novel Girl, Woman, Other, which went on to win the Booker Prize, and then brought her and her work to a whole new level of public attention. And she's just had the most extraordinary couple of years, and she's really utilized this platform to talk about writing and raise awareness of a number of issues to do with like larger society, but also to do with the writing community, and to elevate a lot of writers and their work and bring them more attention to the public. A lot of great writers that deserve more attention. Like earlier this year, she was involved in curating this series of books with Penguin called Black Britain Writing Back, and I've read one of those novels, and it's sort of reading this reminded me I want to read more of those books. But it was really pleasurable learning about her development as a writer, and being born into a mixed race family. So her mother is English, and her father is Nigerian, and she has many brothers and sisters, and she talks about really poignantly growing up in a very busy household that wasn't very big in London, and then growing up to start working and start writing, and the many different areas of London she's lived in. And it's interesting talking about how she talks about her many different books, and how her many different books are sort of unintentionally plotting the development of London itself, and tracing how the city has changed over time. And I found it so interesting, her reflections on race and her own particular background, and especially how she really poignantly addressed this issue that I have a lot of issues thinking about too. Like I think in some ways talking about racial identity, I mean, it's so limiting because we are all made up of so many different backgrounds, and so to just talk about one race or another, it's it feels like pigeonholing people in a way. But then at the same time, because racism continues to be such an issue in society, it is something that needs to be talked about. And I like how she discusses that quite frankly, that these sort of identity markers aren't ones that we should still have to put upon people, that people shouldn't have to live under these labels, but at the same time we need to have them because we need to have the more discussions about this and raise more awareness about it. And I found that really meaningful, but also it's such a great book about the inspiration of creativity in itself and the real dedication of that. And she's a writer that dedicated herself to writing for so long, even though her books received a lot of critical acclaim and she had a readership, but not such a wide readership as she does now after winning this prize. And so I think it's so extraordinary, her dedication to this and how she describes the pursuit of creativity, that it's not really made up of, it's the end goal really isn't this success, although it's a very nice thing, and I'm so happy that it's happened to her. But the goal is really to express yourself in this way and to offer a different point of view to the public, to see things from a different angle that they might not have seen before. And I really appreciate how she describes that journey. And so this was just such a great book to read and such a joy, and I really appreciated her point of view. I also read another memoir this month, which I was inspired to read because I went to see the play. There's a new production of The Normal Heart by Larry Kramer at the National Theatre, and I went to see this new production. It was really powerful and moving. This was a play that was written in the 1980s during the height of the AIDS crisis, and Larry Kramer was involved in combating that, and so this is a play very much about that and the difficulty of making people. I mean, there was so much ignorance around AIDS, and I mean this is all well known, and but it's like important to think back on this, and but also about how there was a lot of infighting and difficulty amongst the gay community about how to handle a response to this disease and all of the deaths that were happening around it. And quite naturally, a lot of people wanted to just like bury their head in the sands and not think about it. But then so many people were affected by it and continued to be affected by it. And it was a very powerful play to see. And it reminded me that I wanted to read this memoir, which was published at the beginning of this year, called All the Young Men by Ruth Coker Burks. I don't know why I have such trouble saying her name. Ruth Coker Burks. I want to say Cocker Burks. But anyway, she is an extraordinary woman that was living in Arkansas in the early 80s and was going to see a friend who was sick at the hospital, and a friend that whose illness had nothing to do with AIDS. But while she was at the hospital, she noticed that a room was sort of cordoned off, and nurses were arguing about who was going to take food into this patient's room. And she discovered that this was a patient suffering from AIDS, and she took it upon herself and was brave enough to go into this room and speak to this young man that was really at death's door, and she held his hand and comforted him during his dying hours. And it took such bravery to do that because she, like so many of the nurses and staff at this hospital, didn't understand this disease, didn't understand how it was spread, but she just saw a man that was suffering towards the end of his life and took it upon herself to go help him and assist him, and to have the humanity to do that, which was such a powerful statement. And because of this experience she was inspired to help more people that were suffering from this and dying from this, and help them during their dying days when their community and the hospital and their families turned their backs upon these individuals that were dying and suffering in such a horrific way. And I think that is just so incredible that she did this and became a real activist within the community and a real bridge. And so, yeah, she details that journey and how she got involved in this, not only in the dying of these men, but in helping them live, in helping them get the assistance and care and medication that they needed. And it's such a powerful story, but also, and you would think that with such a memoir, it would just be all bleakness and horribleness, because so many of these men that she became real good friends with were just dying left and right around her. And she follows the stories of the journeys of a lot of these men, and we find out a lot about their particular personalities and how these beautiful, creative men died really long before their time. But there are so many moments of lightness and joy and pleasure in her interactions with them, but also learning about her own life and the blatant hypocrisy of especially the strong Christian community in Arkansas that were acting in a very unchristianly way of expelling people and condemning them. And so there's a lot of she has a lot of like witty, funny comebacks to people that attack not only people around her but she herself, and it's part of her bravery that she put herself in her danger, and she had a young daughter. And so yeah, it's such an incredible story, and I'm just filled with admiration, and I think it's a powerful book, and like I said, there's a lot of lightness and joy in it as well. So don't be put off by the heaviness of the subject matter. I'd really suggest reading this memoir, and especially as we're in nonfiction November now, this would be a really great book to read that I highly recommend. I also read Elizabeth Strout's new novel, Oh, William, and this is really interesting to think about, because this is the third book, the third time she's featured the character Lucy Barton, who she first started writing about in 2016 when she published the novel My Name is Lucy Barton, and which was a really interesting story. I had some issues with it because it's quite a difficult novel to get into. It's such a concentrated story about Lucy Barton's illness in time in hospital with her mother, and then speaking with her estranged mother who comes to visit her, which she's quite surprised about, and then we learn about over the course of the next novel, Anything is Possible. And Anything is Possible is really more like a collection of short stories looking back on Lucy Barton's past in life, but also different people in the community, the rural community that she grew up in, and Lucy Barton goes back to her community in that. And then in this new novel, we follow Lucy later in her life when her second husband has died, her beloved second husband has died, and she reconnects with her first husband, William, who she had 2 daughters with. And at a point in William's life when he learns about a part of his family history, and that he has this sister that he never knew about, and he travels back to Maine, where his mother grew up and had her first marriage and met her second husband, who she ran away with, and but she had a daughter by this first marriage, who is William's half-sister. And so he travels up there to learn more about his mother's past, to possibly reconnect with this long-lost half-sister of his, and Lucy joins him on that journey. So they're reconnecting with each other. This makes it sound like quite a complicated story, but it's actually quite a simple story, following Lucy's life during this time and her reconnection with William. And it's not so much about whether they will or won't get back together. It's more about how they've had this long-standing connection with each other and know each other in a very intimate way, and still use pet names for each other, but then had this distance from each other. And but it's also about Lucy reckoning with her place in the world and her place in her life. There's a lot of sort of almost existential parts of this, but it's written in a very enjoyable and easy to read style that it's such a pleasure to read Elizabeth Strout's prose. I just love her writing, and but I wouldn't say this is Elizabeth Strout's best book. There's some parts of it which I think are sort of striving for profundity. I mean, there are a lot of moving and insightful things about this book, but there are some parts of it which I feel like she's sort of trying to get there too hard and almost come across as a bit glib. And also, the story itself is so meandering. It's kind of a road trip novel around the state of Maine that it just doesn't have the concentration or focus to make it as powerful a story, I think, as My Name is Lucy Barton and Anything is Possible and some of Elizabeth Strout's other novels. But because I'm so invested in this story and following Lucy Barton's story, I found this really enjoyable to read, and also personally because I come from the state of Maine and was born and raised there. There's a lot of in-jokes about sort of Maine that I really enjoyed, especially about how people in the state of Maine often eat quite early, both for like lunch and dinner, and so a lot of the time William and Lucy are struggling to find a place to eat that's actually open, like a restaurant that's open, because they close quite early because people eat so early. And so Lucy Barton sort of idly wondering, like, when do people in the state actually eat, because they find it so hard to somewhere that's actually open. But yeah, that's I recognize as a very personal thing to me, as something that I enjoy about this novel that other people not so familiar with the state of Maine might not enjoy so much. But yeah, it's still, I enjoyed reading it so much, even though I don't think it's her best book. I also read a few books that have been nominated for the Goldsmiths Prize, and I made a separate video talking about these books, so I won't get into them in too much detail. But I did finish reading Sterling Karat Gold by Isabel Waidner, which I was still reading when I made that video. And yeah, this is such a burst of creativity. Waidner's style of storytelling is so wild and funny. It's a lot of kind of like buddy humor. There's this warm feeling of friendship in their books, which I've read two of Waidner's novels, and both of those books, there's this real sense of camaraderie between these friends who aren't sort of live on the fringes of society, both economically and to do with their identity, that you get this real strong sense of kinship between these families formed between friends, which I really appreciate and enjoy. But also, yeah, just where the storytelling goes is, I mean, it starts with like a bullfight in Camden Town in North London, which is kind of like wild and crazy. But then, yeah, also there's a lot about time-traveling spaceships in this. And so, yeah, it goes into some quite strange places, but it all has a very special meaning and is reflective of the point of view of these characters that don't have a strong voice in society, and so are making themselves known and heard and experiencing the world in a very different way from how they've been set out to do it, and to the way that they're think that they're meant to live. And yeah, I just really appreciated this different point of view, and I know it's not for everyone because it doesn't have a sort of traditional plot in the way, or a traditional way of telling a story, because it incorporates all these fantastical elements into it. But I really appreciate it as a different point of view. I sort of think of Isabel Waidner as a modern day Joe Orton, the great playwright, because I think a lot of elements of his storytelling is very similar to Isabel Waidner's, and so yeah, I'm sort of like, who does this writer remind me of? And yeah, I think it is Joe Orton. And so yeah, and also the novel Little Scratch, and which is just following the course of a day in a woman's life living in London, following her sort of train of thought through these different columns of text. I mean, it's not all columns of text. I mean, some of it is just like quite big blocks of text following her experience, but then other parts, yeah, are going through and quite sort of chaotically across the page following her experience. And it's so enjoyable how it does that. I would think that this style of writing might be sort of alienating, but it is just really getting into the experience of someone's train of thoughts and follows that, reflects that in a really engaging way and a really relatable way. I mean, I love how she like goes on a train and is trying to see the title of a book that someone else is reading and gets sort of frustrated and annoyed with that person because the cover is kind of covered up, and so she can't read what the title is, and I've had that experience many times on public transportation in London, and so almost like defensively like cover the title of my book so that they can't read it either, and it's these like petty things that we sort of engage in over the course of our day. But then also there are deeper things going on and issues that she's struggling with, which are gradually revealed over the course of the book, and how she's almost suppressing these thoughts. And it's almost like what we don't consciously think about, that is some of the most important things going on in our life at the same time. And yeah, I really admire how she does that. And it's really interesting to compare this with the novel Checkout 19 by Claire-Louise Bennett, because this novel also gets into a lot of the details of train of thought and experience and development of a person's life, but through an indirect way. So it sort of follows a woman's life, a young woman's life over the course of her early life as she wants to be a writer, but also her reading life, and really reflects her experiences as a reader. And so it goes into a lot of that experience. There were some parts of this book where I was just like, I don't know what's going on or what she's talking about. It's kind of interesting, but I can't really follow it. But then there are other parts that I thought were really relatable and I strongly connected to. Like she describes early on in her experience being at school and being able to work on class projects much better as an individual than as in a group. And that was something I found very much in my educational experience that, and probably spills over into my real life as well. If there's a project I want to work on, I can do that in a really concentrated way. And I think my creativity really comes out when working as an individual, but when trying to work as a group, like I sort of stand back as a participant because I want everyone's voices to be heard and everyone to have input, but not everyone always does. And so I always had a clash of experience where if I had a group project to do in school, it usually wouldn't come across very well because it would be quite disorganized, and unless there was a strong leader to the group, and I wasn't willing to be that leader. And so those projects wouldn't come across very well. And I remember multiple times teachers expressing their disappointment, you really didn't shine through in this, and well, yeah, because I had to work as a group, but if I was just working on myself, I know I could have done a really good project. And anyway, that's just a very small part and scene of this book, but it's something that I really strongly connected to, and I think is an example of, there were multiple different moments of that throughout this book, and how it can be such a relatable and enjoyable text, as well as being a text that's written in an unconventional way. And I think this novel has a really strong effect in that way. So yeah, that's something I thought was really interesting about that, and I would highly recommend if you are alienated by the Booker Prize and aren't interested in following the Booker Prize for reasons that I talked about in a recent video talking about the shortlist and possible winner of the Booker Prize, I'd really suggest following the Goldsmiths Prize, because they elevate books and voices that I think aren't given platform and read as highly amongst a general readership as they deserve to be. And I think a lot of the books nominated for this year's prize, but also in past year's prize, really deserve more attention and to be read. Anyway, that's that. And I also read Simple Passion by Annie Ernaux, and I'd also made a separate video talking about this and details of this, so I won't get into it that strongly, but just following the course of an affair that Annie Ernaux had, or is it autobiographical? Is it a character that she's created? That's part of the tension she creates in her work. But based on what she said in interviews and talking about this book, I think it is strongly based on her own experience. And so as a woman having an affair with a married man, and that experience of getting so lost in this all-consuming passion of this man that it just dominated her life, and reflecting back on that, and not placing any value judgments on that, but just analyzing the experience of what that passion means, and or does it have any meaning, questioning that. And I thought that it was so powerful and moving how she does this. And when I was talking about this book in my video, I was talking about affairs, but I wasn't necessarily meaning extramarital affairs or affairs outside of relationship, but just romantic entanglements that I think a lot of people have had. If you've had that experience, then you'll probably be able to relate to and find this book really interesting. So yeah, it was a great reading experience. And then I read a couple of books sort of around Halloween to sort of set with the mood of Halloween, and I know there's been some criticism recently on BookTube about seasonal reading and like, oh, you don't need to read a book in a particular season, because obviously, and it's true, obviously you can read it any time of the year, but I think it's important to note that the reading experience doesn't just happen in this sort of concentrated, isolated way outside of the experience of what we're doing in the world, but the reading experience can be enhanced by a particular season or a mood, or other things that are going on in our life in the world. And so I don't think it's invalid to read spooky fiction around Halloween, because it enhances the mood of that. And so I read Joyce Carol-Oates' new short story collection, The Ruins of Contracore, and I hosted the launch of this event, which I just wanted to do, not because I was paid or anything like that, but just because I love Joyce Carol-Oates' writing and always happy to help promote her work. And it is a great short story collection. There are short stories that Joyce Carol-Oates, I think, wrote and published over roughly the past 20 years or so, but this is the first time they've all been collected together. And there's a lot of creepiness and psychological tension in these stories, which is so delicious and eerie, and really did set the mood of the season, and I really enjoyed them. And especially the title story, The Ruins of Contracore, it's sort of set in this landscape very like her sequence of Gothic novels, and I sort of wish she'd expanded this story out to be a full novel, because it fits very well into that landscape where it follows a family story, and the patriarch of this family has been kind of ruined, and so has to go live in the actual ruins of a family estate, which are very dilapidated and falling down. But then there are eerie, faceless people that start appearing to this family that are struggling to maintain their sanity and their livelihood in these very dilapidated circumstances. The stories in this are so good, and I just found them riveting and really engaging. And finally, I read Bitterhall by Helen McClory, which is a novel of possession of three different characters that are two of them are in a flat share along with another individual, and it follows their story in turn. So first you get the story of a man that fancies his male flatmate, but is doesn't know whether this can be realized or not, because that flatmate has a girlfriend, and then you follow the girlfriend's perspective through going through a particular series of events, and then you get the story of the flatmate who's the boyfriend and the flatmate of the man who fancies him. And you get the same events through each of their different perspectives. And it's really interesting how she builds the story and the tension of what is happening between this boyfriend and flatmate who is possessed by a spirit of an 18th century gentleman who left a diary behind, and he's been reading that diary and then is sort of possessed by his spirit. And there's a whole mystery behind that, which is gradually played out, and you find out the story of that, as well as the story of what's happening between these characters in the present time. And yeah, it's really interesting how that plays out. I think her writing is really inventive and takes a very different angle on the psychology of these characters and how that plays out. But also there's a deeper meaning to the story about how writing and our culture is passed down through the generations, and how personalities themselves are infused with this writing, and how that is passed down or not through the generations. And so yeah, this element of the spirit, of whether the spirit is alive or not, really plays into these like deeper questions, as well as creating a sort of scary and intense story of this in bodily inhabitation of this spirit. And I think the novel is probably a bit over long. I wasn't bored by going back over the same events, but I think the story is stretched out a bit too much. It's 350 pages long, and I didn't think it really needed all of that space. But at the same time, her writing is really engaging and insightful in a lot of interesting ways. So I did really enjoy reading this novel, and it was good for this particular season. So those are all of the books I read. Like I said, I'd like to know if you read any of these books, or if you're interested in reading any of them now. Please let me know about it in the comments below. But also let me know about what you've been reading this month, what you've been enjoying or not enjoying. If you've read any books around the season of Halloween or the autumnal season in general, please let me know about those as well. That would be fun to know. Or if you have any nonfiction books that you're planning to read for Nonfiction November, let me know about those in the comments. I feel like I'm asking a lot of you, but yeah, obviously you don't have to do any of that. If you just want to say hi in the comments, that would be lovely as well. But thank you for listening to my long rambling thoughts about all of these books. I always try to make my reading wrap-up videos shorter, but there's always so much to say that I end up going on and on about all the books. But I want to thank some individuals in particular, especially Stephanie Windsor, Joye Schwartz, Peter Longworth, and Bob the Bookerer for becoming members of my channel. Recently I added membership option to my channel, which I was sort of debating about and wasn't sure if it was something I should do, but I thought if people want to support me and think of it as like adding me a tip if you enjoy my content, if you want to become a member, it would really help me out because of work issues going on and finances to allow me to continue to make more content, and I really appreciate their support and help with this and becoming members. And especially Bob the Booker in particular, I want to thank him just for being a friend, because I've had lots of conversations with him over the past month when I've been going through some things, and it's been really helpful as a friend to talk some things out. And it's always enjoyable talking about books with him because he's such a great, passionate and insightful reader. And so I'd really recommend following his booktube channel as well, which I've recommended before, but I'll put a link to it below because yeah, he makes really great videos and it's wonderful hearing his thoughts about books. So thank you again for watching, and I hope you're reading good things, and I will speak to you again soon. Bye-bye.